Hello, everyone. I'm Alisha Alexander and Director of Empowerment and Impact Finance at Carbonbase. I'm in all of the opportunities that you have today for impact and change. I'm in all of what's actually afforded to you at this stage in your lives. As you know, it's not all about choice. Most things in life are opportunities, and to have both is a blessing. I wanted to talk to you a bit today about your journey, where you're starting here today. We all have our mountains to climb, as you just saw in the previous video. Growing up in Conway, South Carolina, in a still de facto segregated South, I grew up in a town called Sandridge, and on a windy dirt road called, that was literally called The Hole. There were 9 children, as Elliot mentioned, and not really enough money to stretch and go around. To leave the hole was, no doubt, a celebration. I lived in an area constantly flooded by storms, and even in our rented home was taken away by Hurricane Hugo when I was a child. But I was not concerned about climate change. Like many that live in these environments and are most affected by climate change, I felt more immediate threats. There was poverty, there was lack of access to healthcare, lack of jobs, poor education systems, and the all-encompassing racism. But there's also resilience and a grit in these neighborhoods that we need to foster and grow. And a lot of what you need is hustle and hope, which we have in our communities. I ignored the 16 lines about slavery in my thick history book at school, and I determined to teach myself, to grow, and to nurture myself. I managed to get a full sponsorship to travel to my ancestral home of Bolivia, seeing the Altiplano and the effects that governments can have on agriculture. And then I arrived in the greatest city on earth, New York City. Your heart beats harder and faster, and your dreams just constantly get bigger. I studied at Columbia University. Admittedly, I was less focused on my economics, international affairs, and pre-medical degrees, and more at fighting systemic racism, trying to convince Columbia College to have things like ethnic studies programs. We sat on the steps of Low Library, for any of you CUNY students who have been up to Columbia, and we chanted ethnic studies now. And we chanted until we became hoarse. And we were determined that you could not know where you were going until you knew where you were from. And today, students at Columbia University can study Asian American studies, Native American studies, and African American studies, which seems mundane now, but at the time, it was a question. I was still determined to change the world in New York City, but remember, I'm poor and I'm Black. I'm a woman. I have an Ivy League degree, but none of that really matters when you don't have a foundation of economic support. So I took a role at Goldman Sachs. It was my family first, and I wanted to leave no one behind. At Goldman Sachs, I was afforded so many opportunities that I never thought I would have. I worked in London, New York, Beijing, and eventually Hong Kong. Studied mostly in debt capital markets and then moved to the more physical and real elements, the pillar of our society, commodities. In commodities, that experience of 12 years helped me understand the distribution of resources and the justification of those. Moving on to Hong Kong, I grew up, I had children. I saw my children grow up and I decided that I wanted to affect the world that they were going to be living in. I wanted to create I wanted to take the fire that I had when I entered New York City and saw all those lights and went to the Puerto Rican Day Parade and shouted at the festivals, Boricua Morena. I took all of that energy that I had at that time in New York, and it somehow came back to me later in my life. And I decided that I was going to do something about it. And that's why I ended up at Carbonbase. If I had the opportunities that you have today, like this Greenlight Festival in my youth, there's no telling what it would have done, what I would have accomplished. I wouldn't give up any of the decisions I've made because I'm able to work with people like Elliot David. But the resources that you have available to you today are massive. There are thousands of ways that you can help create and affect change, most of them undiscovered, and most of them can be within you. So what I want to leave you with today is to make sure that you believe in yourself and nurture yourself. Make sure that you try your best to figure out ways in which you can have change in yourself, as well as figure out ways in which you can change your communities. Change doesn't have to be in big steps to the moon. It can be in small steps that you do next door to you, small steps that you do in the neighborhood you grew up in. small steps that you do to affect things that are surrounding climate change, like economic justice and racism. If you are here today, there's a light and a fire inside of you. And my message I want to leave you with is to make sure it's never extinguished. Never. It starts today. Thank you.